Anybody familiar with biblical apocalyptic prophecies knows that the Jews are going to be reunited with the lost tribes, and the anti-Messiah will desecrate the temple, and Israel will be restored according to the prophecy of Ezekiel, including a large new temple. I would like to stress at this point that I don't believe in British Israelism, the idea that the British and North Americans are the lost tribes. I suspect that most of the descendants of lost tribes live in roughly the area of the old Assyrian Empire. There's a debate about the details, and there are prophecies of other things. I believe that the Jews will be reunited with lost tribes by the time the 144,000 are sealed, because the 144,000 come from the 12 tribes, except Dan. There are 12,000 from Joseph, 12,000 from Manasseh. Not sure why, but it fits the general pattern of no two lists of the tribes of Israel in the Bible being identical. A lot of people think that Ezekiel's temple will operate during the millennium. I think it will be the next temple, although it may be cleansed and also operate during the millennium. The reason I think this is that I can't find a description of a temple between the second one and Ezekiel's in the Bible. Maybe Freemasons had a hand in the restoration of Israel. This was still part of God's plan. Maybe many of the present leaders of Israel are Freemasons. Israel is still important in God's plans. Perhaps Israel's problems are partly because God doesn't like having so many Masons in Israel's government. Maybe Freemasons are planning to build a new temple, but there will be one. I inquired with the Temple Institute and was told that the Masons movie was complete rubbish and that none of their members were Freemasons. I'm not sure how they can be sure of that, but I think it's significant that this organisation is openly taking such a stance when I phrase my inquiry in such a way as to not expose my feelings about Freemasonry. Also, Freemasons' evidence that the Temple Institutes are Masonic amounts to a picture of a checkered floor on the temple. There's another Freemasons video showing a picture of priests doing a hand sign like a double Vulcan salute. In fact, I think this is where the Vulcan salute came from, with a triangle. Oh, a triangle! Sorry, but I don't think you can accuse an organisation involved in Freemasonry based on such simple imagery. Maybe somebody other than the Freemasons or the Temple Institute will build a temple. I believe the next temple must be genuinely holy, or else there'll be no significance in the anti-Messiah desecrating it. Some people have issues with animal sacrifices in a new temple. I'm personally not comfortable with it. Ezekiel makes it quite clear that there will be animal sacrifices in the temple he describes. This is a 3D computer model of Ezekiel's temple. I had used a certain amount of imagination because Ezekiel goes into great detail about the floor plan but is rather vague about the upper parts. I want to draw your attention to these 3 inner gates. Ezekiel says of them, Ezekiel 40:38, a room with a doorway was by the portico to each of the inner gateways, where the burnt offerings were washed. I put the rooms here, but I'm not sure if that's what Ezekiel or God had in mind. Anyway, it goes on, Ezekiel 40:39-43. In the portico of the gateway were 2 tables on each side, on which the burnt offerings were slaughtered. By the outside wall of the portico of the gateway, near the steps at the entrance to the north gateway, were 2 tables. On the other side of the steps were 2 tables. There were 4 tables on one side and 4 tables on the other, 8 tables in all, on which sacrifices were slaughtered. There were 4 tables of dressed stone for the burnt offerings, each a cubit and a half long, and a cubit and a half wide, and a cubit high. On them were placed the utensils for slaughtering the burnt offerings and the other sacrifices. Double-pronged hooks, each a handbreadth long, were attached to the walls all around. The tables were for the flesh of the offerings. Unlike Freemasons, I don't presume to argue against the Bible. A few people made comments on the movie about a new temple coming down from heaven in the New Jerusalem. This isn't true. Revelation 20:22, I did not see a temple in the city because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. You can't argue with that. Also, the New Jerusalem will descend from heaven after Satan has been thrown into the lake of fire, and the anti-Messiah has to desecrate the temple before that. The movie claims that looking at things like models of the Jewish temple and the Ark of the Covenant will divert us from Jesus. Remembering these things are made by the Israelites in accordance with God's instructions, and that Jesus is God. I suppose you can take an idol of anything, just as people seem to get addicted to all sorts of things, but I can't really see how looking at something that God commanded to be made can divert from the incarnation of God. On the contrary, it's more likely to help you understand him. The movie refers to the parable of the vineyard and goes on to claim that the keepers of the vineyard were the Jews who killed Jesus. Obviously the Romans had a hand in killing Jesus, but nobody uses that as a reason to hate Italians. However, I think it's more valid to interpret this parable as the vineyard tenants representing the Jewish religious leaders rather than Jews generally. Remember that Jesus, his apostles, and almost certainly most his early followers were Jews. This is also consistent with Jesus' frequent criticisms of the Jewish religious leaders. At one point an article is shown entitled "British Freemasonry Covets Israel." This claims that the pogroms were started by Freemasons to encourage Jews to go to Israel. I find this a bit unlikely, as anti-Semitism has much longer history. The movie also claims that the Temple Institute will facilitate Earth Gaia New Age Kabbalah worship that brings about consensus unification of religions in the Third Temple, where Isis and all of God's texts mentioned will be amalgamated through the Kabbalah into one. Is this really what the Temple Institute is trying to do? I think that the most annoying thing about Freemasons movie was that it kept going on about how you should keep your eyes on Jesus and the Messianics don't do that. I quite agree that about needing to keep your eyes on Jesus. What I take issue with is the claim that Messianics don't do this. What does Messianic mean? All or most of the Messianics I know believe that Jesus, although they prefer to call him by his Hebrew name Yeshua, is the Messiah as well as being the Son and incarnation of God. I asked Freethemasons to explain where they got this information from, but didn't get a clearer answer. I rather get the feeling that Freemasons are attacking what they think Messianics believe rather than what Messianics really believe. But maybe there's a bunch of people out there who call themselves Messianics but don't pay enough heed to Yeshua. Then you could argue that somebody who doesn't accept Yeshua as God isn't really a Messianic. Similarly, I'm not aware of any relationship between Messianics and Freemasons. I asked my Messianic rabbi about this, and he took a decidedly anti-Masonic stance, as did another senior member of the congregation. I suspect that most Messianics have issues with Freemasonry, as most Christians do. Perhaps there is such a thing as a dangerous Masonic Messianic Judaism, but there's also non-Masonic Messianic Judaism. I'm not sure that Masonic Messianic Judaism even exists. All the Messianics I know are strongly opposed to both Islam and homosexuality, although Freemasonry seems to have a positive attitude towards both. This doesn't make a lot of sense, as Islam is strongly opposed to religious syncretism and homosexuality. However, this may suggest that the Freemasons are influencing the left-wing agenda, which is also both pro-Islam and pro-gay. I rather suspect the Freemasons doesn't know much about the Messianic movement, but doesn't like it and is therefore trying to smear it through guilt by association and false claims about its beliefs.